Our second presenter is Kirk Hanson. Kirk is the Executive Director at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara, where he's been for almost the last 10 years. Prior to that, he was at Stanford University for 23 years, for part of that teaching, of course, near and dear to my heart, negotiations. In 2007, he received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Aspen Institute Center for Business Education for his contributions to business and society. And so we give a warm welcome to Kirk Hanson.
Thank you. I'm going to propose 3 questions that we ought to go away from this conference with a partial answer to, if not a complete answer. And it's a kind of summary of what I think we've been talking about for the last 2 days. Those questions are, by what standards or by what ethical values do we want business to operate? Secondly, what are the mechanisms, governance mechanisms, pressure mechanisms that are going to lead business to behave that way? And thirdly, because this is a Global Compact conference, what role does Global Compact play? How does its strategy map to what needs to happen? So those are really the 3 questions. To some extent, this is what my whole career has been about, because I started a pressure group in 1969 to work on corporate responsibility, and I've been involved with a wide variety of organizations over that period of time. I met Georg Kell when he came to the Global Compact. We've had a long, ongoing debate about strategy, and I want to give you my views of sort of where we are. I think the thing, number one, to take the first question, what standards will business operate by? I think we are in a very, a small circle of people in the world talking about that. We have not engaged the breadth of people who need to be in this dialogue. I say that in part because I spend a lot of my time in Asia now. And I serve as the chair of a business ethics center in Beijing. I'm now getting involved in India, where so much of the action in the future is going to be. And who are we? We are Europeans, Americans, some South Africans, fortunately, but we just don't represent the breadth of the people who are going to be answering that question about what those standards are. In part, it's that the ethicists have not seriously engaged Confucianism, have not seriously engaged Hinduism, have not seriously engaged many of the traditions of philosophy and religion around the world that need to contribute. That will be decisive 50 years from now. And so, to some extent, we don't have everybody in the room that needs to be here. And I think our determination of our view of human rights, our view of responsibilities to consumers, our view of the role of the corporation is really a stunted view. And so I challenge all of us. Corporations today, with their extensive operations in many parts of Asia and many parts of the South, are beginning to engage in dialogue and learn more about this, perhaps more than the intellectual community, the academic community, and so on. It's a discussion about what are the values and standards that business will operate by. It's also what economic systems will dominate. If I said to you, to what extent 25 years from now will our economic systems be characterized by freedom of the corporation versus constraints through governance, either global governance through the UN or much tighter restrictions by their national governments? At least my answer would be that I think it's going to be a relatively free and unfettered environment for corporations, and that the number of constraints put on by governance standards will be fairly few. And so that's a part of what we're trying to understand, is what will the world be like in terms of standards we want business to follow and the kind of basic economic systems that they'll be operating in. But the students here will be the ones managing it at that point. We will not. But maybe we can point the way towards it. Maybe one of the standards will be the human thriving and happiness that Sandra talked about. It's an interesting new concept that is being debated. But that's the territory. We ought to be talking about the global ethic that Hans Kung is raising. We ought to be talking about what does Confucianism have to offer and what does Hinduism have to offer and so on. Don't see enough of that. That's number one. It's my answer to the question of by what standards will we live, and are we moving towards that? Secondly, by what mechanism will we drive corporations to behave by whatever standards we come to think to be important? As I say, I don't think global government is on the horizon, that will characterize the global economy 25 or 50 years from now. I think instead we're going to have a relatively free global corporations, much in the way that they are today. There may be more state regulation and control in particular areas than is characteristic today, but the kind of welfare state in Western Europe is not going to be the dominant model, I don't believe, in the world. I'm not sure exactly where the United States will be 25 years from now in terms of regulation of government, but it'll play some role. State regulation will play some role. There will be trends, I would predict, mediated through the United Nations and a few other global organizations, which will define some standards. Whether the law of the seas was the first, to me, the first great example of a standard of behavior about how the seas would be dealt with by private enterprise. I think the debates over corruption, anti-corruption standards globally will lead to some understanding, a better understanding of what anti-corruption standards will be. You asked the question, what made anti-corruption suddenly a relevant agenda item for companies where it wasn't arguably 10 years ago? And I trace it to an intellectual study, a study by the World Bank, which said, you know what? Corruption holds back development. And suddenly there was a lot more interest, both on the part of governments and on the part of companies, because they saw the bottom line impact of corruption. And of course, the whole workings of the media and the fact that we suddenly know that that minister of state in India gave away all of those cell phone licenses to his friends and cost the government billions of dollars. We know that because of the active workings of the media and the bloggers and so on. That has a role in bringing much of this to attention. I think we talk a lot about consumer pressure, employee pressure. Employees like to work for responsible companies. I think those will be factors. My prediction would be those will continue to be minor factors. I don't think the average consumer will make decisions based upon the social profile of the company, nor to a great extent the social profile of the product, the packaging, or whatever else. For a certain slice, I was on the board of Social Venture Network for quite a number of years with Ben Cohen of Ben & Jerry's and Body Shop and other organizations like that. Those are always niche markets, and there will continue to be niche markets, but I don't think that's going to be mainstream. I think the action is going to be somewhere else. Similarly with employees, I hope our MBAs choose to go to work for, quote, responsible companies, and I think at the margin they do think about that, but I think it isn't a substantial factor, and so I think, again, we have to look elsewhere for the answer of where this pressure on companies is going to come. I tend to think the more powerful pressure will be the investment community, and so what I track very closely is what the investment community is thinking about global climate change, for example, exposure to that. In the United States, we have this emphasis now on risk management requirements under Dodd-Frank to have boards consider, or managements. It's interesting, it's not boards, it's management to assess the risk of the enterprise. I think there will be a gradual integration of climate risk, environmental risk, perhaps corruption risk over time. It's not there yet. There's very little. I was in a conference on risk management last week, and it was clear the state of the art does not include much consideration of these social or environmental risks, but there is more coming in corporate practice. In some ways, the investment community has moved beyond where companies are at the moment and is beginning to integrate many of those things into their evaluations of the future of their investments. So I think that's an optimistic sign in the midst of this question of where's the pressure going to come from. And I think the more work we can do on how this does affect the long-term future and the exposure of companies really is important. You need a few more, I was arguing earlier today, you need a few more examples like Siemens and the billions it cost them through corruption, and BP and the billions it's costing them because their deep water drilling was not effectively managed. Get a few more examples like that, and this principle that climate and safety and corruption might affect your long-term interests and bottom line will become more palpable and clear both to the investors and increasingly to the management. We need the measures to make all of these things, whether it's for the investors or whether it's for the consumers or whether it's for our MBAs who are trying to pick companies. And we need measures to make that real and allow it to be actionable. So what's the role of the Global Compact in all of this? I thought the paper that Doug gave this morning was very much on target, asking questions about what function does it play. I think it was a very low barrier thing in the beginning to sign up for the Global Compact. I'm delighted that it's being ratcheted up gradually over time. Companies are very uncomfortable about that. They sign up for something and they think they've evaluated the exposure and then you change the rules on them. But I think that's a good thing. The Sullivan Principles did that very clearly over time, kept ratcheting up the standards. I think the Global Compact needs to keep ratcheting up the standards, whether it's the specific thing of requiring board commitment, but I hope there are other things that they selectively choose to require a greater degree of commitment than simply writing an annual letter and saying, we're just doing fine. So that's one thing. I think it's good to get companies in the tent. It's good to ratchet them up. It's good to have distinguishing levels. I think the new LEAD program is a very good sign because it will say there are some companies that are more equal than others, and there are some companies that do take the lead, and the investors and the consumers and others, to the extent that they choose to do that, can take advantage of those signaling that takes place. I think the fact that the Global Compact realizes that much of the action is going to remain at the national level. The development of the national networks is a way of creating momentum in the national setting in a way that's an extremely positive development. Similarly, the work on standards through the issue groups is a way of fleshing out the expectations of how companies will operate. I'm a real admirer of what the Global Compact has accomplished and the changes that it continues to make each year as it finds ways of putting additional flesh on this vision of what corporate behavior is and additional pressure and carrots in front of corporations as they move forward. Those are my answers to the three questions. Basically, we got to get a lot more people in the room for the discussion about what the standards are and what the philosophical and values bases are for the debate over what are the standards for business in the future. The mechanisms, I would believe, are not going to be global governance, UN dictated laws and regulations, but are going to continue to be on the state level and through these variety of investor primarily influences, but also some from reputation with consumers and employees and so on. And I hope that when we come together 10 years hence and the Global Compact is 20 years old, that we will see a very different organization that has ramped up and ratcheted up its role in defining the standards and in applying pressure and incentives for the companies. Thank you.
Again, if there's a couple questions for Kurt, we'd love to hear them now. One in the back, and then we'll move to George.
Hello. Yeah, I'm a first-year MBA student here, and I'm from India. It's interesting that you mentioned what Hinduism and other Eastern philosophies speak about business, about the need to be in harmony with nature and society. So my question to you is, do you think that philosophy should be a part of management education?
I think values have to be a part of management education, and that can be embodied in cultural studies, in philosophical studies, in theological studies. I think we have to get back to some basic understanding of our cultural values, of our religious values, of our philosophical values. And so my answer would be yes. Whether that's specifically in the philosophy department depends on your philosophy department. Tim.
Kirk, I think those three questions are very important. I wouldn't use the term mechanism because it suggests a mechanistic understanding of the economy, which is wrong, I think. But I think one important question is missing, and that is, what is the purpose of business and economics? And even if you define standards, for anything, well, you don't define the purpose. Mm-hmm. And so, in economics over 200 years, the question, what does wealth mean? Wealth, the wealth of nations, Adam Smith and so on, was always an important but controversial issue. And so I think, to move forward, and I know in China the question of wealth creation is very important. Mm-hmm. And globalization, wealth creation, etc. So we need a better, more comprehensive understanding of that in order to answer your three questions.
I agree with you, and you point out the importance of the first one, which is what are the standards that companies will behave by, which implies what is the economic system like, what is the purpose of business, and so on. And George is one of the few individuals really in the globe that have worked in Europe, in the United States, and in Asia, so dealing with exactly this problem on a global basis. Tim?
Thank you. I just wanted to offer a thought. As far as I know, as the only Buddhist in the room, I very much appreciated your wanting to include those of us from other traditional religious traditions. But just listening to you and to Sandra, it had occurred to me that Adam Smith, may peace be upon him, he actually spent his life writing and rewriting two books, Wealth of Nations and A Theory of Moral Sentiments, which always seemed to me to say that he saw economic activity as embedded within a social and emotional matrix. And in the same way, economic regulation is embedded in a social and emotional matrix, which then suggests that changes in economic regulation and activity will grow out of that matrix, which then speaks to Sandra, but also speaks to Sir Mark. And in terms of what you were saying, that actually investor activity is much more sensitive as an expression of that underlying social and emotional matrix than the regulatory mechanisms, and therefore is not only more powerful, but also a much more rapid influence on the economic activity. I think that's a different way of conceiving this.
I just want to validate what you're saying and suggest a book to you. David Brooks' new book, Social Animal, deals with this question of do we do things because of our social and emotional makeup? Do we do things because of our genetic makeup? Do we do things because of free will? And the new book basically throws you in the middle of that debate. And I actually am debating him tonight. And so I've been boning up on exactly that, trying to learn as much as I can the last few weeks. So great. Thank you.